The monitor's steady rhythm faltered, dropping into a chaotic, erratic stutter. A dying ranger lay under the harsh fluorescent lights, his chest torn apart. Claire didn't pray. She reached for the clamps, her scrub sleeve slipping just an inch, enough to expose the faded ink. The squad leader froze. Hour 11 of a 12-hour shift smelled like stale bleach, burned coffee, and the subtle, sour tang of unwashed bodies. Claire leaned against the laminate counter of the nurses' station, her eyes fixed on the flickering fluorescent tube near Trauma Bay 3. It buzzed, a low, insectile hum that ground into her molars. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eye sockets, the rough fabric of her scrubs chafing her skin. She didn't want to be a hero. She just wanted to clock out, go back to her cramped apartment, and stare at the ceiling fan until sleep dragged her under. Then the double doors of the ambulance bay blew open. They didn't slide apart with their usual mechanical hum. They were forced off their tracks by a wall of bodies. 5 men. They weren't paramedics. They were massive, clad in civilian clothes that hung wrong. Heavy boots, cargo pants stained dark at the knees, plate carriers hastily thrown over t-shirts. They smelled of cordite, diesel fuel, and the heavy metallic stench of fresh trauma. "We need a doctor, now," the lead man bellowed. His voice didn't crack. It was an order, ripped straight from a combat zone and dropped into the sterile, linoleum-floored quiet of a suburban ER. Between them, they carried a 6th. Claire pushed off the counter. The exhaustion drained from her muscles, replaced by a cold, familiar numbness. It was an old switch flipping in the dark of her brain. She didn't feel a rush of adrenaline. She felt a heavy, mechanical calm settling over her shoulders. "Trauma 1, Claire pointed, her voice flat, cutting through the chaos. "Get him on the table." They hauled him onto the gurney. The man was young, maybe 22. His skin was the color of dirty wax, slick with cold sweat. His chest was wrapped in a crude, bulky pressure dressing that was failing miserably. Dark fluid welling up and spilling over the edges, pooling on the thin white sheet. Dr. Hayes, a third-year resident who had never seen anything worse than a localized gunshot wound, rushed in. He took one look at the sheer volume of the hemorrhage and froze. His hands, encased in the blue latex, hovered uselessly over the patient. What happened?" Hayes stammered, his eyes wide behind his glasses. "Shrapnel," the squad leader barked. He was tall, his face smeared with grease and ash, eyes sharp and dangerous. IED improvised, blew through the door, packed the wound, but he's losing it. "Heart rate is 140 and climbing," Claire said, already moving. She didn't wait for Hayes. She grabbed a pair of trauma shears and ripped through the boy's ruined shirt, the thick fabric giving way with a loud, tearing sound. "BP is tanking. 70 over palp. He's circling the drain." Hayes was still staring. We need to type and cross. Call surgery." "Surgery is 10 minutes away, Hayes. He has 2, Claire said. She didn't raise her voice. She stepped in, physically nudging the doctor aside with her hip. She reached into the gaping wound. The smell hit her then, the unmistakable, sweet iron scent of an open human body. It didn't make her gag. It made her focus. Her gloved fingers slipped through torn muscle and shattered rib fragments, searching blindly in the hot, wet dark. Clavicular artery, she thought, the anatomy map unfolding in her mind like a well-worn schematic. Shrapnel deflected off the bone, sheared the vessel. "Clamp," she ordered, holding her free hand out. A nurse beside her slapped a Kelly clamp into her palm. "He's crashing!" the squad leader shouted, stepping forward, his massive frame casting a shadow over the table. "Back up," Claire said. She didn't look at him. She didn't have the luxury of looking anywhere but the monitor and the cavity beneath her hands. "Give me room, or watch him die." The leader stopped. The air in the room grew suffocatingly tight. Claire felt the pulse. Weak, thready. A dying flutter against the pads of her fingers. She pinched the severed ends of the artery between her index and thumb, clamping down with a brutal, unyielding pressure. The welling fluid slowed. "I've got it," she murmured. "Give me the clamp." "No, the large one. DeBakey." She worked by feel, her hands moving with a practiced, ruthless efficiency that had nothing to do with medical school and everything to do with a dirt-floor field hospital in Helmand. She secured the clamp, the ratchets clicking into place. 1, 2, 3. The sound was deafening in the sudden quiet of the room. "Pack it," she told Hayes, who was finally snapping out of his stupor. "Tightly. We hold him together until the OR is ready. Hang 2 units of ONEG on the rapid infuser. Now." The boy on the table let out a ragged, whistling breath, his head rolling to the side. The monitor stabilized. The erratic shrieking dropped back into a fast but steady rhythm. Claire stepped back, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her gloves were stained dark up to the wrists. Her forearms ached from the tension. She looked at the boy's face. He looked like a kid. Just a kid. The cynicism she carried like a shield cracked for a fraction of a second, letting in a sharp spike of grief before she slammed the door shut again. "OR is ready," the charge nurse called from the doorway. "Move him," Claire said, stripping off her gloves and tossing them into the red biohazard bin. The plastic lid snapped shut with a hollow thud. She watched them roll the gurney out, the wheels squeaking frantically against the linoleum. The squad followed, a tight, protective phalanx. Claire stood alone in the trauma bay. The floor was a mess. The sterile wrappers were scattered like dead leaves. She tasted metal in her mouth. She needed to wash her hands. The water in the scrub sink was ice cold. Claire let it run over her forearms, watching the pale pink soap swirl down the stainless steel drain. She scrubbed viciously, the stiff bristles of the brush digging into her skin until it turned raw and red. She was trying to wash off the smell, but she knew from experience it would linger in her nose for days. She stared at her reflection in the mirror above the sink. Dark circles dragged at the corners of her eyes. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a messy, practical knot, stray strands sticking to her damp forehead. She looked old, older than 32. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was bone deep, a soul weariness that no amount of sleep could fix. She dried her hands on rough paper towels, the abrasive texture grounding her. She pulled her scrub sleeves down, tugging the left cuff firmly over her wrist. It was a nervous habit, one she'd developed over the last 5 years. Keep the past covered. Keep your head down. Be normal. Claire pushed through the swinging doors into the hallway. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a hollow, aching emptiness. Her knees felt a little weak. The squad was waiting in the small alcove near the surgical elevators. They looked completely out of place among the pastel walls and motivational posters. They were a cluster of sharp edges and coiled violence, pacing the confined space like caged wolves. As Claire walked past, the leader stepped into her path. Up close, he was even more intimidating. He was easily 6'2", with broad shoulders and a face carved out of granite. A jagged scar cut through his left eyebrow. His eyes were a pale, washed-out blue, constantly scanning, constantly analyzing. "Doc," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I'm a nurse," Claire corrected, her tone flat. She stopped, keeping a polite, professional distance. "Your friend is in surgery. The vascular team is good here. He has a solid chance. The leader nodded slowly. He didn't relax. The way you handled that in there. That wasn't civilian ER protocol. That was a combat clamp. Claire felt a tiny, cold prickle at the base of her neck. She kept her face perfectly blank. I've been an ER nurse for a long time. You pick things up. You don't pick up that kind of muscle memory from car wrecks, he said softly. He stepped half a pace closer. The smell of ash and old sweat washed over her. I'm Garrett. That's Liam on the table. Claire, she said, offering nothing else. She moved to step around him. I need to get back to my station. Wait, Garrett said. He reached out, his large hand closing around her left forearm to stop her. It wasn't a hard grip, but it was firm. A reflex, honed by years of surviving things that tried to kill her, flared instantly. Claire didn't jerk away. That would show panic. Instead, she subtly rotated her arm, dropping her center of gravity just a fraction of an inch, preparing to break the hold and strike his throat. The movement caused her scrub sleeve to slide up, just 2 inches. Garrett's eyes dropped to her wrist. He froze. The silence in the hallway became absolute. The ambient noise of the hospital, the distant pages, the hum of the vending machine seemed to mute. Etched into the pale skin of her inner wrist was a small, faded tattoo in black ink. It was an intricate design, a cracked skull resting on a shattered compass rose, pierced by a single, stylized trench knife. It wasn't a standard military unit patch. It wasn't something you bought in a parlor outside a base. Garrett released her arm as if it had caught fire. He didn't say a word, but his entire posture changed. The weary gratitude vanished, replaced instantly by hyper-vigilant tension. His right hand drifted instinctively toward his hip, hovering over the spot where a concealed weapon would sit. He took a deliberate step back, creating tactical distance. The other 4 men in the squad noticed the shift. They stopped pacing. They didn't draw weapons, but their bodies angled toward Claire, their eyes locking onto her with a sudden, chilling hostility. The air in the alcove grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. Claire slowly pulled her sleeve back down. She didn't break eye contact with Garrett. Her heart wasn't racing. The cynicism she relied on rushed in, a dark, familiar tide. Of course, she thought. Nothing stays buried forever. Where did you get that? Garrett asked. His voice was no longer a low rumble. It was a razor blade. I don't know what you're talking about, Claire said, her voice perfectly even. Don't play games with me, Garrett hissed, glancing up and down the empty corridor. That's a Task Force 73 brand, the Ghosts. They don't exist, and they sure as hell don't scrub in at suburban hospitals in Ohio. Claire let out a slow, tired sigh. She looked at Garrett, really looked at him, stripping away the tough guy exterior to see the tired, traumatized operator underneath. She used to be exactly like him. TF-73 was disbanded 5 years ago, Claire said softly, dropping the civilian nurse persona completely. Her voice lost its bedside warmth, turning dead and flat. Everyone involved is either dead or erased. If you know what that ink means, Garrett, then you know exactly what I'm capable of. And you know that you should turn around, sit down, and wait quietly for your boy to get out of surgery. Garrett's jaw tightened. They said the Ghosts went rogue, sold assets in Damascus, burned their own handlers. They say a lot of things, Claire replied, her eyes narrowing. Most of it is a cover story, written by suits who have never washed their best friend's blood out of their hair. She took a step toward him. Garrett held his ground, but the tension in his frame cranked higher. I saved your man's life tonight. That's the only thing that matters in this building. You don't know me. You didn't see anything. Understand? One of the other men, a heavy-set guy with a shaved head, shifted his weight. "Boss," he murmured, a question hanging in the air. Garrett raised a hand, stopping his men. He stared at Claire, his mind working furiously behind his pale eyes. He was calculating the odds. He was weighing the fact that she had just saved his brother against the terrifying reputation of the ink on her wrist. "You're a long way from the sandbox, Ghost," Garrett said quietly. "We all are," Claire said. She turned her back on him, a deliberate, arrogant show of dismissiveness that went against every tactical instinct she had, and walked down the hall toward the nurses' station. Her spine prickled the entire way. She could feel their eyes on her, heavy and calculating. She knew she had made a mistake. She should have let Hayes try to pack the wound. She should have kept her hands in her pockets. She reached the station and sat down heavily in her rolling chair, pulling a chart toward her. Her hands were perfectly steady. She looked at the clock. Hour 12. The shift was almost over, but Claire knew, with a sinking, hollow dread in her gut, that the real bleeding had just begun. The past didn't just knock, it kicked the door off its hinges. And now, a squad of rangers knew exactly where the ghost was hiding. The time clock punched her card with a harsh, metallic clack. 6:05 a.m. Claire pushed through the heavy glass doors of the employee exit, stepping out into the brutal chill of a Midwest morning. The air was damp, smelling of wet asphalt and rotting leaves, a sharp contrast to the aggressive sterility of the hospital corridors. She pulled her oversized fleece jacket tighter around her chest, burying her hands deep in the pockets. Every muscle in her body vibrated with a low-frequency ache. Her right knee throbbed in time with her heartbeat, an old souvenir from a botched exfil in Kandahar. She kept her chin tucked, eyes tracing the grease-stained concrete of the parking garage floor. Level 3. Row C. The sodium vapor lights overhead hummed a sickly yellow, casting long, distorted shadows between the parked cars. It was a dead zone, silent except for the distant drip of condensation. She saw the boots first, heavy, scuffed, desert tan. They belonged to a body leaning against the driver's side door of her 12-year-old Honda Civic. Claire stopped, 15 feet away, her right hand buried in her pocket, instinctively wrapped around the cold, heavy brass of her keys. She slipped the longest key between her index and middle fingers. A pathetic weapon, but one she could drive through an eye socket if cornered. Garrett pushed off the car. In the harsh yellow light, he looked worse than he had in the hallway. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving him hollowed out, the jagged scar on his brow pulling taut over exhausted eyes. He wasn't flanked by his squad. He was alone. "You're a hard woman to track down, Claire," he said, his voice scraping like sandpaper against the quiet. "No last name on the hospital directory. License plates registered to an LLC. Get away from my car," Claire said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. The exhaustion made her tone utterly devoid of warmth. Garrett took a half step forward, raising his hands, palms out. A placating gesture that only made Claire's jaw tighten. "I need 5 minutes, that's it." "I don't care what you need," she replied, closing the distance to 10 feet. "Liam is stable. Vascular repaired the artery. My job is done. Move." "It wasn't a random IED, Claire," Garrett said, dropping his hands. The desperation in his voice was raw, unpolished. "It was a shaped charge, breaching explosive. They hit our safe house. We barely got Liam out." Claire stopped. The familiar, bitter taste of old copper flooded her mouth. She didn't want to hear this. She squeezed her eyes shut for a fraction of a second, fighting the urge to turn around and walk right back into the brightly lit safety of the ER. "I don't care," she repeated, though the words tasted like ash. "They're hunting us," Garrett pressed on, taking another step. "We intercepted a drive 2 nights ago. Corporate wet work. The kind of stuff the ghosts used to handle. We thought we were hitting a cartel stash house, but we stepped into a private intelligence firm's cleanup operation. Now they're tying up loose ends. Us. So go to the police. Go to your commanding officer." "We're off the books," Garrett spat, a flash of genuine anger breaking through his fatigue. "Just like you were. There is no cavalry." Claire stared at him. She saw the familiar ghost in his eyes, the crushing, suffocating realization that you were entirely alone in the dark, and the monsters were real. She hated him for bringing it to her doorstep. "I fix holes, Garrett," Claire said softly, her grip on the keys loosening just a fraction. "I don't make them anymore. That girl with the ink on her wrist, she died in a ditch in Damascus. I'm just a tired nurse who wants to go to sleep." "They traced the ambulance," a new voice echoed through the garage. Claire whipped her head around. One of Garrett's men, the heavy-set one with the shaved head, Carter, stepped out from behind a concrete pillar 20 yards away. He held a suppressed Sig Sauer down by his thigh. He wasn't looking at Claire. His eyes were glued to the ramp leading up to level 4. "Black SUV, 2 hitters. They just breached the lower gate," Carter reported, his breathing shallow and fast. The garage suddenly felt like a tomb. The damp cold seeped through Claire's fleece, sinking directly into her bones. "You brought them here," she hissed, a venomous, unadulterated fury spiking through her chest. "We didn't know," Garrett said, his hand dropping to his waist, pulling a compact Glock from beneath his jacket. "We thought we lost them on the interstate." A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed down the concrete ramp. Tires rolling slowly over the speed bumps. Claire looked at her Honda. It was a trap. The garage was a fatal funnel. Her pulse finally spiked, the heavy mechanical calm violently shattering as the suppressed, dormant predator inside her tore its way out. "Don't shoot," Claire snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "The acoustics in here will amplify the slide action. It'll sound like a cannon on the lower levels. They'll call the cops. Then we're all dead." "What's your play, Ghost?" Garrett asked, his eyes locked on the ramp. Claire didn't answer. She ripped off her fleece jacket, dropping it to the greasy floor. She was just in her thin, dark blue scrubs. The cold bit into her skin, but she didn't feel it. She scanned the immediate area, her brain processing the environment in jagged, hyper-focused flashes. A rusted fire extinguisher box, a stack of discarded drywall, a maintenance cart. She moved. The black SUV crept down the ramp, its headlights off. It looked like a shark gliding through dark water, silent and utterly lethal. Claire crouched behind the rear bumper of a hulking F-15. Oh, her bare arms pressed against the freezing metal. Her chest heaved, but she forced her breathing down, drawing the icy air through her nose. She gripped a heavy, solid steel tire iron she had yanked from the bed of the truck. Its rough, rust-flaked surface dug into her palm. Garrett and Carter were pinned behind a concrete pillar near the elevators, completely out of position. Amateurs, Claire thought bitterly. They were used to open combat, to kicking down doors. They didn't know how to fight in the shadows. The SUV stopped. The heavy doors clicked open with a soft, expensive sound. 2 men stepped out. They didn't look like cartel thugs. They wore tailored dark coats and moved with a terrifying fluid economy. Professionals, cleaners. They carried suppressed submachine guns, sweeping the aisles with clinical precision. One of them moved toward the elevators, tracking Garrett's position. The other broke off, walking down Claire's row, checking between the parked cars. He was 10 feet away, 8 feet. Claire could hear the soft squeak of his rubber-soled shoes against the concrete. She smelled expensive cologne and gun oil. She didn't plan. She let the old, terrible instincts take the wheel. As the cleaner stepped past the tailgate of the F-150, Claire exploded upward. She didn't shout. She didn't hesitate. She swung the heavy steel tire iron in a brutal, horizontal arc. The heavy metal connected with the side of the cleaner's knee with a sickening, wet crunch. The man let out a sharp hiss of pain, his leg buckling instantly. Before he could fall, before he could raise his weapon, Claire stepped in, closing the distance to 0. She dropped the tire iron. It was too slow for close quarters. Her left hand shot up, fingers hooking viciously into the collar of his expensive coat, pulling his weight forward. Her right hand, stiffened into a rigid blade, drove upward into the soft cartilage of his throat. It was an ugly, desperate strike. The cleaner gagged, his eyes bugging out in shock. He thrashed, a wild, panicked swing of his heavy weapon catching Claire in the ribs. The impact stole her breath, a blinding flash of pain exploding in her side. She stumbled back, tasting rust. He raised his gun, gasping for air, his finger tightening on the trigger. Claire lunged again. She grabbed the hot suppressor with her bare left hand. The metal seared her palm, a sickening sizzle echoing in the quiet, but she held on, forcing the barrel upward. With her right hand, she drew the brass key from her pocket and drove it with all her body weight into the soft, unprotected space just below his ear. The man froze. A strange, wet gurgle rattled in his throat. His grip on the weapon went slack. Claire stepped back, letting him drop. He hit the concrete with a heavy, unceremonious thud. The smell of voided bowels and hot iron filled the narrow space between the cars. She stood there, trembling violently. She looked at her left hand. The palm was blistered, the skin burned white and red in the shape of a cylinder. It hurt. It hurt so much it made her vision swim. A muffled pop, pop, pop echoed from the elevators, followed by a heavy crash. Claire leaned against the truck, clutching her burned hand to her chest, fighting the urge to vomit. The silence returned, thicker and heavier than before. A moment later, Garrett jogged down the aisle, his gun lowered. He saw the body on the ground. Then he looked at Claire. She was covered in grease, her scrubs torn, her face pale as a sheet. She looked broken. "Carter got the other one," Garrett said quietly, his eyes lingering on her blistered hand. "You?" "Shut up," Claire whispered. Her voice shook, raw and jagged. "Just shut up." She walked past him, limping slightly, holding her ribs. She didn't look back at the dead man. She reached her Honda Civic, pulled the door open with her good hand, and slumped into the driver's seat. The cheap fabric of the seat felt like heaven. Garrett stepped up to the open door. "Claire, we owe you. We can protect you. Come with us." Claire looked up at him. The exhaustion in her eyes was absolute. There was no hero in there. There was just a woman who had tried to build a quiet life on a foundation of corpses, only to watch it crumble again. "Clean up your mess, Garrett," she said, her tone dead. "Scrub the security tapes, and if you ever look for me again, I won't use a key." She slammed the door shut, ignoring the screaming pain in her hand as she jammed the ignition key in and cranked the engine. The old car sputtered, then roared to life. Claire threw it into reverse, tires screeching against the damp concrete. She didn't look at Garrett as she drove past him, tearing up the ramp toward the exit. The harsh morning sun hit her windshield as she broke out of the garage, blinding her. She didn't know where she was going. She just knew she couldn't go home. The ghost was awake, and the quiet life was over. That intense hospital hallway was just the beginning. Did you see that brutal parking garage fight coming? Claire tried to bury her past, but the ghost is officially awake, and now she's on the run again. Do you think Garrett and his squad will survive without her, or will they track her down again? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you loved this gritty, action-packed story, smash that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more original, heart-pounding thrillers.